Ember Witch. Book 1. The Lich. Volume 1. Black Tragedy. Chapter 2. The Nightmare Begins. September 8, 457 to October 17, 458 BME. Fragment 14. A Botched Job. Vera and Fevra had been on the road for over a month now. They were almost to Shikari and had stopped to camp for a day of much-needed rest.
Before we enter Shikari, there is something I need to talk to you about,
Fevra said after they had finished setting up their tent.
What is it?
Vera asked calmly as she got comfortable on the ground.
I was lying to you. Before I met you, I had come into contact with necromancy. I didn't know what it was at the time, but now I can see the truth. I used necromancy to murder my brother. I had no control over it, but in the moment it felt so good to let the power in,
he said, looking down at his hands.
I knew you weren't being truthful about it, but that doesn't mean I am angry with you about it. I need to know everything that happened that day. I know you don't want to share that information right now, but in time I will find out everything. You can try to hide it from me, but it won't stay secret for long,
Vera said, not giving him much, if any, sympathy.
Perhaps I will tell you everything, but not now. The wounds are still too fresh,
he replied, getting quieter. They spent the remaining hours sleeping and resting from the long trip. In the cold air of the night, Fevra stayed awake longer than he should, going over the events of that day just as he had so many times before. They finally made it to Shikari, and Fevra was dumbfounded by its beauty and lack thereof. His amazement was not from the cobblestone and wooden walls of the tiny buildings or the unhappy and distant Firen who inhabited them, it was from seeing the ocean for the first time. He had been taught as a pup that Valsilla, Sin's Garden and Ghost Island were the only land masses on the entire planet. All attempts to explore the ocean have failed due to the ships never being seen again. This information had been passed down over a few hundred years, so most scholars of the day believe that the planet simply ended and the ships plunged into the endless void. Fevra wasn't sure whether to believe this or not, but seeing endless blue before his eyes, he knew that the ocean was just as large as he had been told.
Oh gods, that's right, you have never seen the ocean before. Focus on your job,
Vera said coldly, looking at Fevra like he was a child.
Fine.
Fevra sighed, then followed her through the town to the home of the victim.
Hello there, my name is Bria and this is Gree, my husband. I was recently informed that your family has been involved in a great tragedy. We were sent by Mordecai to investigate the incident,
Vera lied as the old man opened his door.
Oh. Please come in, I will go over everything I know,
the old man replied with emotions welling up in his voice. Vera and Fevra entered the home, which was one of the largest buildings in the town, but still so small compared to the massive buildings they had been surrounded by in Myopia just months ago. They sat down on old creaky chairs around a short table in the center of the main room and awaited their host to do the same. The old man slowly sat down, then scratched his ears. His once orange fur, now turning a light gray, looked rough and uneven, as if the stress of age and loss had caused several sections to grow longer while others had shed.
We would like to start at the beginning. Is there anything you can tell us about your daughter and how she was murdered?
Fevra asked after a moment of silence that sat uncomfortably in the air. Vera looked over to him as if she was disappointed she didn't get to speak.
We were having a nice dinner together, and after we finished eating, a strange man broke in and assaulted Lina. We tried to get him away from her, but he used his color to keep us frozen in place. Unfortunately, we were born without the color, so we were powerless against him. My wife and I watched as Lina bled to death after he had fled,
the old Firen said, holding his emotions back as best as he could.
Can you describe what he looked like? His color, fur, and even how he was dressed?
Fevra pushed, hoping the old man would have explained the situation in more detail.
He was a silver coat. He wore what looked to be a leather jacket and standard pants. His color was a light greenish-blue color, almost teal. Never have I seen a color like his before, but it's definitely unmistakable when you see it. I remember he had the stench of Haven stem about him. I've always told Lina it made you crazy, but there's not much you can do about strangers using it.
The old man said after running his hand across his snout in thought.
Did he have any distinct markings? Any pattern or spots on his fur? Perhaps any jewelry or piercings?
Vera asked before she was yet again cut out of the conversation by Fevra.
He had no spots that I can remember and no jewelry either. I'm sorry I can't give you more than what I have. He was in and out within a few moments and the entire situation was so terrifying that I didn't have the thought to look closer at him.
The old man replied with regret.
It's all right, I think we have enough to get us started. I am sorry for your loss and we will bring this killer to justice.
Vera said as she stood up.
One last thing before you leave. I am curious as to how Eli Ren got this far east. I know it's none of my business but I am very curious indeed.
The old man said as he watched Fevra stand.
I left my pack in search of something and found it in Bria. There's not much of a story to tell really.
Fevra lied with a straight face. He was wearing his hood up to cover his mark of exile. He had thought that if other Lyran had traveled here they may have spoken about the laws of the Lyran and he didn't want to look like a criminal pretending to be a guard. It was a more believable story that he married into a position of power.
I see. Well, I know that the packs never split up unless they need to. I have no intention of revealing your secrets, but I have lived long enough to know that if you lie to yourself enough those lies will become truths. No matter how you came here, just be true to yourself.
The old man said, then stood up and walked to a dresser, opening the drawer and pulling out a small wooden box.
I got this years ago from some traveler for a few coins. Strange that I have held onto it all these years without knowing what it is. Perhaps you can make better use of it than I can.
The old Fyron said, holding it out to Fevra, who hesitated before he took the box. He slowly opened it and found a round object wrapped in a cloth. He examined the orb and looked puzzled.
This is a great honor. I will look after it with great care.
Fevra said, wrapping it back up and placing it back in the box. He tucked the box into a pocket on the inside of his cloak and bowed low to the old man, who in turn did the same. Vera looked confused, but didn't say anything, just watching the two have their moment of respect. They left shortly after the bow, closing the door lightly behind them. After a few minutes of silence, while they got distance between them and the house, Vera finally asked the question that had been burning in her.
What was that thing? I felt no color in it, and even more confusing is how you reacted to it.
Fevra touched his pocket, feeling the small box, and sighed.
It's a children's toy. When I was a pup my father gave one to me. We would play catch with it.
Vera almost fell as she started laughing.
Seriously? I was thinking it was some sort of religious thing or even a binding object, but no, it's a toy. Good gods, that's hilarious.
Vera said, holding her sides from laughing so hard.
I know it's not important, but hey, I didn't want to seem like an asshole. Plus it reminds me of my childhood, back when things were more simple.
Fevra replied as he started to blush from embarrassment. After leaving the town, they had stumbled upon a camp and had stopped to gather information. They both knew it was a long shot since it had been so long since the murder had happened, but any information was good at this point. They sat quietly in a patch of tall grass, watching the small group of Fyron set up their camp for the night. Vera leaned her weight into Fevra as she slowly stretched her arms, causing Fevra to stiffen up.
I didn't know this was a date,
he whispered, and Vera elbowed him in the arm while rolling her eyes.
Don't try anything or I'll cut your toes off,
she replied as Fevra rubbed the bruise now growing from her strike.
Well, it looks like it's time,
Vera said, then began moving slowly through the grass towards the camp. Fevra followed close behind. After several months of training, he had learned to quiet his movements without color. He still made noise, but his steps were softer, his breath smaller and more focused than it ever had been before. They approached the camp without making any noise. As they got closer, several of the Fyron drew their weapons and color as if threatened.
Who are you and what do you want from us?
an older male asked, holding his short sword up in a ready position.
Who we are doesn't matter. We are looking for a male Fyron with teal color. He was last seen in Shikari where he murdered a young woman and was said to be heading this direction with a pack.
Vera said as she placed her hand to her sword's hilt.
We have no idea what you are talking about. None of us have seen such a mage.
The older man said, turning his head to look at Fevra.
It's not very often a Lyran leaves the forest. What brings someone like you so far east?
The old man continued.
Why I left is none of your concern. Why I'm here is because a young girl lays dead and we need to find our killer.
Fevra replied, watching the old man closely.
I assure you we had nothing to do with it.
The old man said, keeping his stance on the matter firm.
We are wasting our time with these beggars. They are all weak in color. None of them could have used anything more than a small spell.
Vera said, then began walking away.
I am sorry we were of no help to you. Perhaps you could look to the south. Many fire and travel closer to Myopia than clear up here in the north.
The old Fyron said as Fevra began to follow. After getting a few hundred paces away, Fevra spoke in a quiet whisper.
What now? We have no leads.
Our next move is to head to Halcyon. Neela informed us that he may be heading in that direction.
Vera replied. The training room was empty besides for Cress. She had taken to training on her own since everyone in the Cinder was out on assignment besides her. She glowed vibrantly, lashing her magic out in tendril like whips that sprouted from the ground in a circle around her. She struck each target with a crack as the magic burned small holes through the wood. After an hour of boring repetition, she dropped her aura, began cleaning up the targets, and made her way to the bath before leaving the sanctuary. She walked the short distance from the cave entrance to Myopia's upper district, passing schools, churches, street vendors, bakeries, smiths, and other local businesses before arriving at her destination. The garish building stood taller than the rest around it, despite none of the buildings in this district being exceptionally tall. The overall aesthetic being a mashed-together church with the bell tower, if you could call it one, looking as if it were 3 times fatter and 2 times smaller than any normal bell tower should be. She walked up the set of rickety wooden stairs that felt almost half-rotted and opened the door. She was blasted with the obnoxious stench of a dozen different perfumes, old but still edible cheese and wine, with the underlying scent of fear, sweat, and sex. The women all dressed in exposing dresses, tights, skirts, and anything else that would make them look the most appealing to their customers. As part of their profession, Cress was greeted at the door by a few women, each attempting to persuade her to follow them to their rooms for pleasure or conversation.
Sorry ladies, I am not here for that,
Cress said, pushing past the girls and headed up the stairs. She made it to the 2nd floor and walked past several rooms before she stopped. She hesitated for a moment and took a deep breath before opening the door.
For the love of Kellis, privacy please,
called a woman who was on her hands and knees as a male straddled her, thrusting his hips with vigor.
Such a shame to see you like this, mother. We have something to discuss that is far more important than a cock,
Cress said as she shut the door behind her and took a seat before the two.
Cress, what in the void are you doing here?
Talina asked as her drunken customer sloppily continued his thrusting. Cress eyed the man with a deep stare, but he didn't care. He had spent good money to be here and seemed determined to get his money's worth. Talina pushed him off of her and stood up from the ground to cover her shame. The drunken male stumbled to his feet and snorted in anger.
I paid for you, bitch.
He slurred, attempting to begin his pleasure again. Cress just watched as her mother grabbed the man's clothes, shoving them into his chest, and pushed him into the hall, closing the door behind her. She quickly grabbed a robe and threw it on, then repeated her question.
What are you doing here?
Cress casually grabbed a bottle of perfume from the desk she sat beside and examined it before she spoke.
Even after father broke your heart, you still use this perfume. I have no idea why, but it makes me happy.
Talina, frozen in place, eyed her child with uncertainty.
He was a bastard through to his core. Never understood me, never accepted me. You didn't stop him as he beat me. Perhaps out of cowardice, or it was your own way of letting me know you didn't accept me either. I didn't come here to ask for your love. That bridge was burned a long time ago. I have a real family now. People who care about me, who understand me and support my decision,"
Cress said as she placed the bottle back on the desk.
You have no right to lecture me about what your father did. You know just as well as I that he was a monster. Don't for a second think that I didn't protect you from his rage. I did everything I could to get you away from him,"
Talina argued back with a shaking voice.
"Did you? Did you do everything, Mother, or were you a coward? You hid as he beat me, you shook in his presence,"
Cress said, still not moving from the chair.
You have no idea what you are talking about. What do you think, you are a different person now because you started wearing those clothes and calling yourself a different name? You are still the same spoiled boy you have been, Hiroshi,"
Talina said, and Cress shot up from her chair and stepped to her mother,
"Never call me that again,"
her eyes burning with rage.
I birthed you, I raised you. I can say my child's name if I please,"
Talina said, but didn't look Cress in the eyes.
"You're such a coward, you don't even have the strength to look me in the eyes,"
Cress said, then walked to the door. She opened it and stepped out, but before closing it she said in a low tone,
"The sender is after Persian."
Cress hastily scribbled a note and attached it to the messenger hawk and let it fly away. She hoped it would reach Vera before the week was over. After being left alone in the sanctuary, she had been curious as to what the job was that Fevra and Vera had taken. She had waited until Neela had left the sanctuary, snuck into her room and searched through the recent contracts. Finding what she was looking for, she read over it with a horrified realization. Without a name she couldn't be certain, but a male fireman with a silver coat in his middle age and teal color had perfectly described her father. The monster that had beaten her as a child was now a wanted criminal being hunted by her brother and sister. She wanted to let Vera know exactly what they were up against when they found him. He wasn't some master mage, but he was deceitful and arrogant. His vicious beatings he gave her were more than enough for her to know that they could be in for a rough encounter. Vera looked up to the sky as she heard the screech of a hawk. The bird swooped down and Vera reached out her arm and the hawk landed. Vera pulled the small parchment that had been neatly tied to its leg and unrolled it. Fevra came up next to her, stopping his horse just short of hers.
I assume that's about our target. Unless you have a secret boyfriend you are sending letters to,
he said with a grin, but Vera didn't reply.
Are you going to answer me or just sit there like a paralyzed goblin?
Fevra asked impatiently, but with a joking tone in his voice.
Would you shut up? Just for a minute, shut the fuck up.
Vera angrily answered while finishing the letter.
Okay, damn, I was just trying to have fun,
he replied in a whisper. Vera pulled a small parchment and charcoal from her pocket and wrote a reply, attaching it to the hawk's leg and sending it off, before she finally turned to Fevra.
Grass has informed me of our target's name. We have to move fast if we are to catch him.
Fevra made a gesture suggesting that there was more she wasn't saying.
His name is Persian, a drunkard and drug addict keen on violence to get what he wants. Grass knows that he will be heading to Halcyon,
Vera said after rolling her eyes at his ridiculous gesture.
How would she come to this conclusion and how did she learn his name? Did she say if someone had seen him or something?
Fevra asked.
No, she didn't say anything about how she got this information, just that we might have to deal with more than just a murder case. It seems to me that she had a history with this person before joining the Cinder. Neela refused to put her on this job, instead insisting on us. Perhaps because of their history, Neela didn't want Crass to be put in a situation that might cause severe mental damage,
Vera replied, trying to ponder out what was happening.
If Neela knew that Cress could have had a history with this guy, then she also kept us well in the dark about the job. Think about it. We weren't told his name and we had to gather information about him by talking to the victim's family. Doesn't this all seem strange?
Fevra asked.
It's not like Neela to keep vital information from us when on a job. If there is something more happening than just a simple murder, we need to find out what it is,
Vera answered. She adjusted her position on her horse, then pulled out a pouch of Haven stem cigarettes. She placed one in her mouth, then passed the pouch to Fevra. She snapped her fingers, igniting a deep red flame, and scorched the cigarette, inhaling the smoke with a deep breath. Fevra placed one in his mouth, and Vera extended her hand out, the flame still burning, and ignited Fevra's cigarette. The two sat there for a few minutes without saying anything, just enjoying one of the last warm days before winter came through and made their job far more difficult.
I have been thinking about my brother recently. The look on his face when I cut him down still haunts me. I don't understand why it happened. I wasn't in control of myself.
Fevra said after taking a long drag of his cigarette. Vera watched his subtle but unmistakable wince as he spoke about it.
Are you going to tell me what happened after all this time?
Then pulled on her cigarette. Fevra made a pained face, then took a deep breath before speaking.
We were out on a hunt heading east from our camp. We had tracked a bear for several miles and finally caught up to it. After landing a shot in its leg, it took off and we chased after it. Fortunately, we caught up to it,
he said, then took another drag from his cigarette.
After beginning our trek back, I lost myself. When I regained control of myself, my brother's body was lying lifeless on the ground. I had used a giant sword made of black crystal to slaughter several of my pack along with him. I still have no idea what that thing was. After meeting you and learning about necromancy, it is clear that whatever it is, it was created by a necromancer,
Fevra said.
It's not common for necromantic magics to cling to physical objects. It usually sticks with the one using the magic. It needs a living host to survive for long periods of time. If this sword you mentioned was created by a necromancer, it would have been the strongest spell imaginable. The only spell I know of that acts similar is that of blood blades. Where did this sword go after you were exiled?
Vera asked as she mulled over the possibilities of how this relic might have come to exist.
It was taken to the Rosen Rain, my people's greatest city and the one place on the mainland that it can be protected,
Fevra replied after taking a long puff from his cigarette.
As long as it stays in the forest, it should be safe. I don't know what kind of magic created that fog, but no outsider can enter, meaning that we don't have to worry about anyone trying to get their hands on it.
Fevra continued, letting the smoke set into his lungs.
I am afraid the Lyran might not be able to contain the magic. Necromancy is not like color or even soul magic. It feeds off of the color of the world. It requires blood and death to work. The only reason why soul magic is different and taught by some mages is because the only being that suffers is the user. Necromancy is like taking the soul of another person to use magic. It's a twisted and perverted version of soul magic that requires far more than any other form of magic.
Vera explained, then finished her cigarette, putting out the embers of it on her hand and tossing the butt to the ground. Fevra took a long moment to think about what they might do next, letting the high wash over him.
Do we follow this lead from Cress or head south in hopes he escaped to the desert? Either way, we have no idea where he is. Tracking an animal is far different than tracking a wren. Animals have predictable behaviors and leave signs, not thinking that they are being hunted. A man on the run will cover his tracks, hide in the most unlikely of places, bribe or threaten those who see him into not giving up his location. I could use my hunting skills to get a clue of where he might have gone, but with the roads being traveled frequently by foot, horse and carriage, it would be unlikely that we would have luck picking one person's tracks out from everyone else who had traveled by road. If he even took the road,
Fevra said, then put his cigarette out.
Our only real option is to travel to Halcyon and see if this person is our man. If not, then we will be back to square one. Most of the time we would have far more information about our target.
Vera replied, then turned her horse. Fevra took a moment to look out at the landscape before he followed. Neela was sitting calmly as the Morden furiously spoke.
How can you tell me that with such confidence? A member of your clan murdered the Highbell Sage, and instead of sending your best assassin after him, you set her off on a goose chase for a petty criminal who killed a civilian. You have no idea how terrible this situation is. I have the sages at my throat seeking justice. They witnessed the incident in plain daylight. What makes you think that this criminal is more important than the Highbell Sage?
Neela raised her hand to stop Kaisha from going any further.
I have reason to believe this criminal could be useful in our research on necromancy. The report from Halcyon states that he is part of a necromantic coven. He is searching for something. I don't know exactly what it could be, but I assure you it is far more important than a sage. We could be dealing with something far more serious than a rogue cinder,
Neela explained with utter conviction. The Bell Sages were the most powerful mages of the entire Firen race. Their mastery of the color and foresight made them the only beings on Valcilla who could rival the might of the Elven. During the days gods walked upon Haven, they were gifted knowledge of clockwork. The Firen people rallied behind these masters of magic for protection and worldly knowledge. They had constructed the Grand Bell Tower to allow their people to tell the time so accurately that they had single-handedly created the standard timeline of Valcilla. Each second of the world's history was recorded and held within the walls. In the days of the gods, time was a concept only few kept track of. Sundials were a rudimentary and archaic invention that could only track the hours of a single day. The Grand Bell Tower was designed to not only tell the time of day but track the positions of the planets, comets, and even eclipses. Neela knew losing a Bell Sage was a huge blow to the Firen, but if Takashi could assassinate one of them and escape, he was clearly far more powerful than the Grand Bell Sage. She had no idea why he would have killed such an important figure in the world, and she was going to find out, but only after she learned why the necromancers had been so active lately. It wasn't that they were necessarily attacking people or even causing trouble, but more and more reports were coming in from all over the heart that necromantic ritual sites had been discovered. Bodies were taken from their graves and found mutilated. Kaisha paced for a few minutes before she sat on her throne.
What are you going to do about Takashi?
She asked with a sigh.
With Takashi being a cinder, it will be much harder to locate him than a common criminal. After Vera and Fevra return from their current job, the entire clan will track him down,
Neela replied with her usual confidence that made Kaisha all the more agitated.
You are the mother of the myopia cinder and you show no hint of fear towards the current situation. The Grand Bell Sage is dead by a cinder's hand and you are putting more priority towards the murder of a lone noble woman of Shikari. Something that the Morden of Halcyon should be more concerned about than us. I understand that Halcyon Cinder is far smaller than ours, but it is still their jurisdiction,
Kaisha said, trying to understand Neela's decisions.
With more and more necromantic ritual sites being discovered all throughout the heart, it is seeming more likely that they are attempting to perform some sort of ritual. I had taken to reading up on the dark magic thanks to Vera's research and found one that aligns with the evidence we have gathered already. It seems likely they are attempting to forge a blood blade,
Neela explained, expanding on her stance of why she didn't think a Bell Sage was more important than the growing necromantic phenomenon spreading throughout the heart. Kaisha sat back stunned with a look of horror on her face.
Do you really think that this is the case?
She asked, struggling to speak as a lump formed in her throat.
It is a possibility. We need more information before I can say for certain,
Neela replied, then stood up.
I will leave you to run your city. When I learn more I will be sure to let you know, Your Grace.
She continued, then bowed and walked out of the throne.
Do you know how hard it was to pull off this job? I understand that you are paying far more than I usually get for such a job, but this isn't just a common thug. The Grand Bell Sage is not just a normal mage. He was the heart of the tower, the keeper of the world's time. I expect you will appreciate just what it took to make this happen,
Takashi said, not frustrated but something close to it.
Our king gives his thanks for this most important moment,
The green-skinned man said with a small bow. The green skin, red cross-shaped pupils, and long grass-like hair marked this man as a Noki Elven. Over the past few months, Takashi had been meeting this man in secret locations almost exclusively within wooded areas and forests. He had gotten used to seeing the strange transformation that took place during their meetings. He would be told to meet in a specific spot and wait until the Noki shifted forms. He had seen this transformation a few times already, but it still was a surprise. The glowing color would expand around the tree itself and begin to shrink, contort and move as the branches would go from outstretched gnarled things to slender but muscular arms. The leaves almost fused together to become long blades of unkempt and unruly hair. The Noki Elven were a beautiful but very strange-looking race. Although their abilities to change from tree to humanoid were stunning to behold, they had many flaws. This man Takashi had come to know as Jinra looked as if the bark had become massive scars upon his arms. The green complexion swirling together with a light brown hue adding texture to his skin.
I assume that your king has some sort of master plan. It would be foolish to take on the Firen people by just eliminating a single sage. The Mordans control each hold individually, not to mention the Cinder, who is their line of defense once the city guard falls.
Takashi said, and the Noki twitched slightly.
My king's plans are of no concern to you. He will not indulge in revealing everything at just this moment, that is true, but I can assure you that his plan is not to destroy the Firen. If anything, I believe it would be the humans he would be aiming for. No mages besides the church healer live in the Queen's crown,
the Noki replied.
If you require more from me, I will assure that I get far more for my troubles. You know where to find me,
Takashi said, grabbing the bag of coins that lay at his feet, then turned around and walked away. Vera and Fevra finally made their way to Halcyon after 3 months of hard travel. They were exhausted from the journey. They had taken it upon themselves to get a room at the local inn to stay out of the cold. Instead of paying for 2 separate rooms, they decided to share one. Vera took the bed and Fevra fell asleep on the floor almost immediately after shutting the door. They had been sleeping on dirt and rocks for so long that a warm bed, or in Fevra's case a wooden floor, was a blessing. Vera woke first, stretching her sore legs and yawning.
Hey, wake up, we have a fox to catch,
she said as she stood up. Fevra rolled over groaning. A big puddle of drool sat on the floor where his face was.
Very attractive. I love seeing boys drool over me,
she joked as she stripped off her old clothing, then stepped over Fevra naked to her bag. Fevra stood up and looked at her back. 3 scars ran down her exposed back like great claw marks. Her red fur not growing in the place of the scars. Her tail swayed slightly as she put on a new shirt, covering the scars from view. Fevra sat there for just a moment, locking away the scars in his memory. He knew she had scars, but didn't realize they were more than mental.
My sister gave me those,
Vera said as she turned around. She noticed that he had been staring with a near-blank expression on his face. Was he seeing her as an attractive woman or as his mentor? Did he lust after her, or was her body too damaged? She didn't know exactly what made him look at her in that way.
What happened?
He finally asked after coming to his senses.
I was born into a poor and desperate family. My mother died during my birth and my father disappeared shortly after. I was left with my sister, who was only 8 years old at the time. After my sister turned of age, she began stealing and selling her body in order to take care of me. I was so young and stupid. I began to resent her for becoming what she was. We got into a fight one day after I had caught her selling bell spice. We threw punches, bit and clawed each other until finally I had enough and used my color to throw her against a wall. She had dug her claws into my back so deeply I couldn't move my body. I was only 9 years old. I was so disgusted and full of rage that I used my color to snap her neck,
Vera said as she leaned against the small end table her bag was sitting on. She hadn't put on anything but her shirt, and Fevra didn't make any attempts to look her over. He seemed to shrink as she explained how she had murdered her own sister. It wasn't a proud moment in her life, but it made her who she was.
We share a similar pain. I don't want to make you feel any more pain over what has happened. After only a year I am still hurting from what I have done. I can only imagine what you must feel,
Fevra said, looking down at the floor.
Never regret, never drown in your sorrows. We all must move forward. I was young and confused, angry and alone. I did what I did and I can't take it back,
she replied, looking at him with deep passion. Fevra looked up at her and they stared into each other's eyes for a long moment, finally understanding each other on a deeper level. This was the first time that Vera had opened up to Fevra like this. She had always kept her past close to her chest, never revealing anything. Fevra finally understood why Neela had placed him under Vera's mentorship. It wasn't just about her being a top-ranked Cinder, it was about their shared history. Neela could see through him, see the same pain as she saw in Vera when she was brought into the Cinder. Fevra stepped forward and extended his arm, grabbing Vera's hand. They linked fingers and stared into each other's eyes.
Come on, we have a job to do,
Vera said, turning her head away from him and pulling her hand away from his. Fevra stepped back and nodded, still feeling the heat of the moment. Vera quickly put on her tights and slipped on her boots, while Fevra changed his clothes. They gathered their belongings, stuffed the old clothes into their bags, and stepped out of the room. The pub hall was filled with a few dozen guests, all eating, drinking, and talking amongst themselves. As Fevra and Vera passed through the room, no one paid any more attention to them than a passing glance. It was almost refreshing for Fevra, who had consistently had eyes upon him since entering the Heartland. They took a seat and waited for someone to serve them. They had little gold left for meals after being on the road for so long, but they could spare a few coins for a hot meal before they once again went out into the snow. A gruff-looking older man approached them with a piece of parchment and charcoal.
"What can I get for you this morning?"
he asked rather rudely.
"Anything that is not cold would be preferable,"
Fevra replied and set a few coins on the table.
"I've got rice and fish, your choice,"
the old man replied as he shrugged. His red fur was spotted by gray, showing his age and obvious stress.
Rice will be fine, and bring us sake,
Vera said, and the old man nodded, wrote down both items, then walked away. They sat in silence for a few minutes until their meal was placed on the table.
"Excuse me, sir, we are looking for a mage with teal color. Have you seen anyone around these parts who might fit his description?"
Fevra asked before the old man could walk away.
"Plenty of mages pass through here. Not everyone uses their magic like some card trick. If you are desperate for information, I suggest asking the Morden. She would know more about the mages than I would,"
the old man said, and then, before any other question could be asked of him, walked away.
That's fantastic. We are going to have to deal with Lion now,
Vera said, then began eating.
"I assume that because we are from the Myopia Cinder she will not be so happy giving us any information,"
Fevra mentioned after taking a bite.
Of course not, she is going to have a breakdown over this. We usually don't operate outside of Myopia and its surrounding areas. Myopia reaches from the mountains the city was built by, up to Shikari and to the east coast. We are at the border of Myopia and Halcyon counties. The way the east is divided makes Halcyon City itself at the very border of its own county. We will be lucky to have any leeway with Lion given her distrust of Kaisha,
Vera replied, then took a drink of her sake.
"What the fuck do you mean you were seen?"
Takashi said angrily. He had been on the road for the past 4 months, and he was in no mood to hear any excuses from anyone.
"When I killed the girl, her family was in the room. I had no choice but to incapacitate them and run,"
Persian said in a fearful manner.
"You fucking idiot. I told you to kill her and anyone else if needed. My employer is going to lose his mind over such a stupid mistake,"
Takashi said, nearly shaking at this point.
"You botched this job, Persian. The entire Myopia Cinder is going to be hunting you now, and when they find you they will connect me to it,"
he continued with rage.
"What about your blunder with the Bell Sage? The news travels fast, Takashi. Everyone knows a myopic Cinder was the killer. You're just as much to blame for this situation as I am,"
Persian replied, trying to pull the conversation away from his mistake.
"I killed the sage exactly as I was instructed, you jackass. My murder of the sage was a distraction from your next target. I was to kill the sage, flee to Halcyon, and assist in the murder of Lion. After she was dead, you and I were supposed to meet my employer for the payment and passage to Ghost Island, where we could lay low for a while. For Void's sake, you weren't even able to bring the blood of the girl, were you?"
Takashi asked angrily.
"Are you fucking high? Of course not. I was too busy fleeing before my binding spell wore off. This experiment you were trying to do is absolutely insane. Who the fuck tries to forge blood blades? You have lost your mind if you think it's even possible.
Persian yelled out.
Do you realize what you are trying to make? What is your end goal, Takashi? Not only are you taking jobs from the Elven, but you are chasing a legend from an old dead religion. You have lost your mind if you think I'm having part in this any longer. I am leaving tonight before one of your crazy friends come after me. I spent far too long here as it is without the fear of being captured by your clan of psychopaths.
Persian said and attempted to push past Takashi, who stopped him by extending his collar. Vera stopped walking and scanned the streets.
What is it?
Fevra asked after a moment.
Takashi,
she said and began walking towards the emerging power that surged through the air. Fevra followed her, not knowing exactly what she was doing. He hadn't been around Takashi long enough to know his color by feeling, but the amount of energy flowing through the air was strong and almost fogging his senses. They ran past alleyways and shops, tracking the source of the magic, finally coming upon a flash of heat and color. Takashi was casting a jet of pale yellow fire from his hands as Persian tried his hardest to deflect the spell with his own teal shield spell. Persian was backing away, sweating as the cinder unleashed his full force against his shield. Takashi was not going to let him get away, not going to let him survive. He knew far too much, was involved in too much to get away alive. He pushed further and further into the alley, backing Persian into a wall, before a voice spoke out, breaking his concentration.
Takashi? What in the void are you doing here?
Vera asked as she stepped into the alley. Takashi turned slightly to see Vera and Fevra standing in the only way out of the alley, besides for up. He was cornered now, up against two cinders and a mage stuck straight in the center. He had been so sure he would have been far gone before anyone could track him, but now he was trapped. Vera looked past him, seeing Persian still holding his teal color around him, ready for another blast of energy.
You are joking, right? We have been on your trail for months now, and Takashi is the one to corner you.
Fevra asked, expanding his color around himself. Takashi made the first move, seeing the color flash around Fevra. He lashed out, throwing a fireball straight into Fevra, who didn't expect to be attacked, causing him to crash to the ground. Vera, although stunned by this attack, was quick enough to put up a shield before another fireball could take her out. Her red aura flashed around her, then expanded out, absorbing the fire.
What the fuck is your deal?
She asked just before Takashi sprinted forward and kicked her in the stomach, launching her backward out of the alley. Persian, now not the center of attention, pushed a wave of energy out in the instant that Takashi brought his leg down from the kick, forcing him to tumble to the ground. Persian took this moment of surprise and tried to run from the alley, but was stopped by Fevra, who had recovered from the initial attack. Fevra shot out 3 darts of blue energy, forcing Persian to duck and deflect the spells, keeping him from getting any further than the entrance of the alley. Both Vera and Takashi were standing now. Takashi lashed out, creating several tentacles of pale yellow to whip out at all 3 of his opponents. Vera and Fevra were quick enough to block the attacks with a shield of color, but Persian, who had just recovered from the darts, was struck by one of the tendrils, searing a deep burn into his left arm. With a grunt of pain, he stumbled back and cast a beam of teal-colored ice, which created large crystals along its path until it hit Fevra, freezing his legs to the ground. Vera pushed a wave of energy out with such force that it flung Persian into the wall, smashing his head against the bricks, rendering him unconscious. Takashi struck again with the yellow tendrils, which were deflected by shields from both Vera and Fevra. Vera ran forward, keeping one hand up holding a shield and the other conjuring a deep red blade, which she used to cut through each of the tendrils. Fevra cast a blue jet of flames at his feet, melting the ice, freeing him. He joined Vera in a frontal assault, conjuring a 2-handed sword, which he swung down in an attempt to break the shield Takashi had just cast around himself. Takashi, seeing the 2 blades crashing through his shield, jumped backwards and conjured 2 yellow blades of his own. He easily deflected Vera's shorter blade with one and used the other to redirect Fevra's great blade. He rushed forward using his opponent's slower recovery to get in a quick slash at Fevra's neck but missed as Fevra dropped the great sword and conjured a dagger, ducking quickly under the slash and getting in his own quick stab. The blue blade sunk deep into Takashi's leg, then disappeared into smoke as blood drained from the wound. Vera, taking advantage of the situation, cast 3 red darts into his other limbs, hoping to incapacitate Takashi, who clumsily deflected the attack, limping off to the right of both his opponents.
What in the void are you doing? Just stand down and we can talk about this. We have Persian already, there is no need to continue fighting each other,
Fevra said after a few ragged breaths. Takashi looked back to the unconscious man lying within the alleyway and snarled. He wasn't going to give up yet. He hadn't finished his work, he still had to kill Lion. He knew he was outmatched, but he wasn't going to stand down. He gathered his energy and sprinted forward, conjuring a pale yellow long sword. Fevra drew in his power and deflected the slashes from the blade as Vera came in for another shot to incapacitate Takashi. He ducked under a dart, slashed away a quick stab at his stomach, sidestepped a kick and finally brought himself into a powerful cleave. Fevra had overextended his last attack, leaving his sword arm too far out. He could feel what was coming, but had absolutely no time to stop it. The pale yellow blade sliced clean through his arm, severing it at the elbow. It dropped to the ground with a terrible thud as Takashi spun on his foot, kicking Fevra in the stomach while using his momentum to throw him to the ground in a spiral of blood and screaming. Vera nearly screamed but was quickly interrupted as Takashi turned to her and cast out several thread-like lines of color that wrapped around her hands. He jerked the threads, causing Vera to be pulled, losing her balance and falling to the ground. Fevra was writhing on the ground as his arm poured blood into a puddle around him, covering him, causing him to lose all sense of where he was. Vera rolled away from several attacks and spells, then threw herself onto her feet. She expanded her color, which snapped the lines holding her hands together, then, in a rage, blasted her energy out. Everything around her was blown back. Food stalls destroyed, glass windows shattered into dust, barrels and crates smashed against walls. Everyone who had begun gathering around after hearing the fighting and screaming were knocked to the ground. Takashi, even holding a shield, was no match for her energy as she directed it straight into him. She shimmered with a deeper, more vibrant color. Her eyes went blank white and she began to cry crimson tears. Takashi was blown back, smashing into the wall, which shattered his bones. His flesh and fur began to shred into nothing as Vera concentrated on destroying every last part of him. Takashi's body was nothing more than a bloody pile of goo before Vera finally dropped to the ground.